I was never particularly grabbed by Andrew Yang during the Democratic primaries because it seemed like he had a good heart, but he had kind of the libertarian tech bro, framework that prevented him from meaningfully addressing a lot of the things that he brought attention to. I do appreciate Yang for bringing real attention to universal basic income. I think that's cool. I really do. He seems like kind of a weird guy. Is it weird to say I don't think he's that presidential, He looks like he'd be a really cool, I don't know, like, coworker? Is that a weird thing? I feel like if I worked with Yang, it'd be like fucking rad. You know what I mean? Like we'd be hanging out all day. It'd be a great time. But he's so chill. I don't know. One way or another. One way or another. He got himself in hot water just the other day. I want him as a boss, Vosh. Nobody bosses me around, except for all of you, constantly 24/7. Anyhow, Andrew Yang got himself in a bit of a tizzy here, and wow, that is a very large donation alert. Thank you very much. That I should probably resize and take a little bit out of the way since it's kinda right up there. I'm standing with the people of Israel who are coming together under bombardment attacks and condemn the Hamas terrorists. The people of New York City will always stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel who face down terrorism and persevere. Now this thing got ratioed right here. 31,000 quote tweets, tens of thousands of comments asking him to, reconsider just a little bit. Maybe think a little bit about this. It's interesting, actually, because what Yang is doing right now completely deviates from the crowd and the attitude that he had cultivated back before, Because Yang had two major, support groups, okay? The more libertarian-leaning Democrats and, for some reason, alt-righters. Not sure how that happened, whatever. I'm not going to hold it against him here, but neither of those communities like interventionism in Israel, Now, I'm not to say that he's changing his positions on this matter. I'm sure this is something that he believes. It's just, it's interesting. This deviates significantly from, the broader attitude people tend to have towards him. Anyway, he got giga-ratioed for this one, and probably justly so, for reasons that we're about to talk about. Andrew Yang is currently running in the New York City mayoral race. And, wait, Vosh, how is he wrong on this one? We'll talk about it shortly, in my opinion. Andrew Yang is currently running in the New York City mayoral race. If I were a cynical man, and I am, I would say that it is true that Jewish people represent a pretty large block of voters in New York City, and he could be trying to appeal to a marginalized demographic in order to further his chances in that mayoral race. Because it seems like a very contentious stance to take that could potentially, it's a high risk, high reward. You could end up looking off really great. It doesn't look like that's what happened here, but I'm not saying that's why he's doing it for sure, but it definitely plays into the potential. Yeah, but plenty of Jewish people support Palestine? That's true, yeah. I'm not saying it was a great strategy. I'm only saying it may have factored into his ideas. So, why is what he said wrong? Well, I'm standing with the people of Israel. This is fine. Standing. I like standing. People are cool. Not a huge fan of the state of Israel, but, I like people of Israel, who are coming under bombardment attacks and condemn the Hamas terrorists. The people of New York City will stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel who face down terrorism and persevere. The language of this tweet pretty clearly makes it sound like Israel is under attack and is defending itself, and that Yang supports their act of defending themselves. This is an inaccurate characterization of what is currently taking place. I would like to talk about what's actually happening. Unfortunately, every time I talk about issues like this, I get accused of partisanship or bias. I get accused of leaving out this or that. So we're going to do something egregiously and obnoxiously overcompensatory today, okay? We are going to directly read a Wikipedia article. That is right, people. We are cutting right through the thick of the matter, and we're just going to look directly at the Wikipedia article. Because every time I try to synthesize or construct everyone, you miss that, you do that, we're just going to look at the Wikipedia article. Okay? That's what we're going to do. Wait, Vosh, you can read? A secret skill that I have planned out for this exact moment. I understand a lot of you are going to find this uninteresting. You're an idiot. This is extremely important. Please pay attention, okay? You can edit the article. If anything I'm about to say is factually inaccurate, then I encourage people to email me afterwards, and I will amend my statements in a future video. Ongoing clashes began on the 6th of May between Palestinian protesters and Israeli police over a planned decision of the Supreme Court of Israel regarding evictions of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, East Jerusalem. Please do not get on my case for any mispronunciations during this stream. I will try my best. The violence, which coincided with the holiday of Laylat al-Qadir and Jerusalem Day, has injured more than 300 people, mostly Palestinian civilians. The attacks drew international condemnation and resulted in a delay of the Supreme Court ruling by 30 days as Aviachi Mandelblit, Attorney General of Israel, sought to reduce tensions. On the 9th of May, Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a major holy site to Muslims, ahead of a flag march by far-right Jewish nationalists that was later canceled. So I want to clarify this entirely, okay? Imagine if you had, like, an indigenous protest, or, like, not even a protest, if you had, like, an indigenous holiday that it was going to be marched upon by, like, the Charlottesville crowd, and before Charlottesville got there, the National Guard came in to clear out the Native Americans. Like, whew. In response, on the 10th and 11th of May, Hamas and Islamic Jihad fired over 400 rockets into Israel, hitting homes and a school, killing 2 Israeli civilians and injuring at least 70 Israeli civilians. Israel responded with airstrikes into Gaza, and according to Gaza officials, at least 24 Palestinians, including 9 children, were killed, and 103 more were wounded. According to the IDF, at least 15 of those killed were members of Hamas, and many others were killed by Palestinian rockets. So this is editorialization on my part. I don't believe the IDF for 1 nano-fucking-second, okay? So we have independent assessments saying 2 Israeli civilians were killed, and that almost all the people they killed in retaliation were Hamas. And then you have the IDF saying, actually, you know, way more Israeli citizens were killed, and actually, no. I do not believe so. Let's get some background on this. So one of the issues that I often find arises in conversations about the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people is that Israel does something really fucking shitty, and a bunch of people criticize Israel for it, which is fine. But then people who like Israel will say, well, look at this shitty thing the Palestinians did beforehand. So to me, this is an extremely unproductive back and forth, and it makes about as much sense as people saying, look at this shitty thing a cop did. And then a conservative says, oh yeah? Well, look at the thing the black person did beforehand. That's about what it feels like to me. The problem is that whether you like it or not, Israel is responsible for the situation that both of these states are in right now, Palestine and Israel. It's not like the Palestinians chose this situation. They're not the ones who put them in the position that they're in right now. They're not the ones who control the interaction or the engagement, the discourse. They're not the one backed by the most powerful military force on the planet. Israel has all of the power. And Israel pushed the Palestinian people into a position where violence was an inevitable consequence of what's going to take place. For Christ's sake, the Palestinians live in an open-air concentration camp, okay? You seriously think there wasn't going to be violence in this situation? Only one power has the power there. Only one power has the power. Only one entity has the power to end the violence, and that is not the Palestinian people. If the Palestinian people throw up their arms, they say no more violence, not any, in 100 years there will no longer be any Palestinian people. Because the Israeli genocide of their people will continue slowly, bit by bit. Their culture, their land will be gobbled up, and they will be gone. If the Israeli people throw their arms up and they say, all right, we're done, we're not doing this anymore, you know what happens? A 2-state solution, and the continued existence of both groups. That's the reason why I'm predominantly critical of Israel. It's not because the Palestinian people don't do bad things. They do. Hamas does bad things. They fired rockets at a school filled with Israeli civilians. There's no getting around that. Hamas is not a good organization. It's not a good group. But even Hamas has said that they would support a 2-state solution, something Israel is unwilling to back. Even the terrorists of the Palestinians are more amicable to compromise than the organized government elected by the Israeli people. Of course, everything I'm saying is highly, highly nuanced, way more complicated than I'm giving it justification here. But I want you all to understand, at Vosh, you know the Hamas would not settle for peace. And we have a lot of people with really strong opinions on the extent to which both groups are sincere in their attempts to push for peace. Hamas supported a two-state solution as a transitional state for them taking over all of Palestine, though. Israel never should have been built there, buddy. You really blame Hamas for saying they want to reclaim land that 70 years ago belonged to their people? The point is, in the immediate moment, right now, they're more amicable to that position than Israel is. That's not to say they don't do bad things. That's not to say they're not a terrorist organization. Israel is the group with the power to amend the situation, and they choose not to. Polls done amongst Israeli civilians show, and I'm being charitable here, a very harsh attitude towards the Palestinian people. Vosh, they would kill all Jews if they could. Israelis would not. I strongly disagree with your perspective, but I know that if I start arguing with Zionists in chat, we're going to go on this forever. Let's focus back on the particular situation we're looking at. You'd think with my history, Zionists wouldn't be in my community, but that's okay. Hopefully you will take the opportunity to expand your understanding of this issue. The disputed land was bought by Jewish trusts from Arab landowners in 1876. In 1956, the Jordanian government, in cooperation with the United Nations Organization for Refugees, housed 28 Palestinian refugee families with tenancy rights in a compound on land that Jordan managed as custodian of enemy property, and which formerly belonged to these Jewish trusts. God, this stuff gets complicated. After the Six-Day War, the area fell under Israeli occupation. Speaking of things we can complain about on behalf of Israel, Jesus. In 1972, the Israeli custodian general registered the properties under the Jewish trusts, which in turn demanded the Palestinian tenants there pay the trusts rent. Eviction orders began to occur in the 1990s. The Jewish Trust sold the homes to a right-wing settler organization who have since made repeated attempts to evict the Palestinian residents. Again, I just don't know how in any situation you can feel anything for the Palestinians here but empathy, you know? Under Israeli land and property laws, Israelis have the right to reclaim properties in East Jerusalem owned by Jews before the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, but no similar law exists that would allow Palestinians to claim their lost property inside Israel during the Nakba. The Nakba, you should probably know about this, also known as the Palestinian Catastrophe, was the destruction of Palestinian society and homeland in 1948 and the permanent displacement of a majority of the Palestinian people. The foundational events of the Nakba took place during and shortly after the 1947 to 1949 Palestinian War, including 78% of the geopolitical entity then known as Palestine being declared as Israel. Can you really blame Palestinians for being a little salty? 4/5 of their country got Thanos snapped into Israel. The exodus of 700,000 Palestinians, the related depopulation and destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages, and subsequent geographic erasure, the denial of the Palestinian right of return, the creation of permanent Palestinian refuges, and the shattering of Palestinian society. Again, Israel are not the victims in the situation. This is the trail of tears, okay? People who are on Israel's side in this conflict, it's like the equivalent of like crying crocodile tears for American settlers in the 19th century after the displacement of Native Americans. Like, it's unbelievable that people would ever, under any circumstance... You know there were Native American raids on, like, American villages, right? Like, I guess the Americans should have genocided more? Like, this is an insane logic to me. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked. The inequality of treatment of property rights that has been deemed unacceptable in international law by the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, and furthermore, some analysts argue that the precedent set by these measures to resume Jewish property rights in East Jerusalem would open the gate for Palestinians to claim entitlement to the restitution of their properties in West Jerusalem. Look at that. The analysts are arguing that if they allowed the Israelis the leeway they want, that it would give the Palestinians a legal precedent to start reclaiming territory in West Jerusalem. Vosh, well, okay, but are you supporting Native American separatism now because of that history? You know what, dog? if right now there was an ongoing border conflict between America and open air concentration camps, including Native American people, I wouldn't be supporting Native American separatism. I'd be encouraging Native American reconquest of the Americas. Yeah. Oh yeah, including your flat in whatever fucking Bay Area city you live in. Yeah, absolutely, okay? They will crawl across the United States in a wave of tanks and reclaim their ancestral territories from you and you specifically, okay? You first. I don't care where in America you live, okay? Your house is being designated the first judicially ordained reclaimed territory of the indigenous peoples of America, okay? And then they can get the then they can sort out the rest, okay? We will make them the colonizers. No, my positions on Native American land back issues right now are informed first and foremost by pragmatism. The issue is, if you took Native American reservations and made them like independent nations right now, they would just starve. The necessary economic infrastructure hasn't been set up to afford them the ability to engage in like a emancipatory action. So that's probably not the right direction to go like there. But yeah, in the case of the Palestinian people, that was their whole country within a lifetime ago. There are people in Palestine alive today who remember back when they had the whole country and now they have their little fenced-in area, you know? This is a very immediate thing currently happening. But the end goal is open borders, correct? Of course. Absolutely. All right, what were we doing? Anyway, in 2010, the Supreme Court of Israel rejected an appeal by Palestinian families who had resided in housing units in the area of Sheikh Jarrah, East Jerusalem, who had petitioned the court to have their ownership of the properties recognized. In 2021, we're catching up now, Israel's Supreme Court was expected to deliver a ruling on whether to uphold the eviction of 6 Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem on the 10th of May. Getting real close right now. Itamar Ben-Gvir, this piece of shit, a far-right Israeli politician, visited Sheikh Jarrah shortly before the clashes began, where he said the houses belonged to Jews and told police to open fire on protesters. There you go. Agence France Presse reported that Israeli settlers had been seen in Sheikh Jarrah openly carrying assault rifles and revolvers, leading to the clashes. Previous clashes had begun following the Israeli government's closure of the Damascus Gate, a popular place for Muslims to gather during Ramadan, and when the Israeli government imposed a 10,000-person limit on people praying at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Palestinian protests were also frustrated with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas' decision to postpone the 2021 Palestinian legislative election, believing he had done so to avoid political defeat for his party Fatah. This is a whole other story and a whole other complicated thing, okay? Here we go. We're on it now. Palestinians and Israeli settlers first clashed on the 6th of May and were broken up by the intervention of the Israeli police, who arrested at least 7 people. Further clashes continued at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society said 136 people were wounded across Jerusalem that evening, and the Israeli government said 6 police officers were also wounded. More clashes occurred on the 8th of May, on the date of the Islamic holy night of Laylat al-Qadr. Palestinian crowds threw stones, lit fires, and chanted, "Strike Tel Aviv," and "In spirit and blood we will redeem Al-Aqsa," which the Times of Israel described as in support of Hamas. I like how the Wikipedia article said that it was a newspaper who described it in support of Hamas, rather than saying it was something supporting Hamas, because saying they want to redeem the mosque that they have been legally barred from attending as they previously were, I don't know if that's necessarily support of Hamas, you know? The Israeli police, wearing riot gear and some on horseback, used stun grenades and water cannons. At least 80 people were injured. On the morning of the 9th of May, we're getting into it now, Israeli forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, injuring hundreds. Palestinians threw rocks, firecrackers, and heavy objects. God, this, if anything, sums up the Palestinian-Israeli, like, military divide right here. Listen to this sentence. Palestinians threw rocks, firecrackers, and heavy objects, while Israeli police fired stun grenades, tear gas, and rubber bullets at worshippers. Okay. The storming came ahead of a Jerusalem Day flag march by Jewish nationalists through the Old City. At least 215 Palestinians were injured, 153 of whom were hospitalized. Militants in Gaza fired rockets into Israel during the night. There you go. During the evening and night of the 10th of May, riots erupted in Lod. An Arab mob threw stones and firebombs at Jewish homes in the city. This is bad. Attacked a school and a synagogue. This is bad. And set fires. This is bad. A Jewish resident shot at Arab rioters, killing one and wounding two. The mob later attacked the hospital where he and others injured were evacuated to. On the 10th of May, Hamas fired more than 150 rockets into Israel from Gaza. The IDF said 7 rockets were fired toward Jerusalem and Beit Shemesh, and that one was intercepted. An anti-tank missile was also fired at an Israeli civilian vehicle, injuring the driver. That's not good. Israel launched airstrikes into the Gaza Strip on the 10th of May. That was yesterday. 26 Palestinians were killed, 9 of whom were children, and 103 more were wounded. A Hamas commander, identified as Mohammed Abdullah Fayyad, as well as 2 high-ranking Islamic Jihad commanders, were also killed. According to the IDF, a number of the Palestinians killed, including 3 of the children, were killed by errant rockets fired by Hamas, not by airstrikes, and that at least another 15 of those killed were members of Hamas who were launching rockets or firing anti-tank missiles at Israel. However, the victims died when the Israeli strikes were carried out. So this would take a while for me to substantiate, but over the past 2 years of looking at stuff from Israel, I think the IDF lies a lot. Like, a lot. Whenever there are conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians, they propagandize so fucking hard, so aggressively, and independent journalists are constantly catching them out in it, and nothing ever happens. On the 11th of May, Hamas and Islamic Jihad responded to the Israeli raids, launching hundreds of rockets at Ashdod and Ashkelon, killing 2 people and wounding more than 70 others. Hamas claimed they were firing their largest ever barrage, firing 137 rockets in 5 minutes. And go them for effort enacted, I guess. So what do we have to say about all of this, okay? Well, first of all, I don't want what I say right now to be conflated as a defense for Islamic jihadists or for Hamas, because I think that those organizations are largely destructive. That being said, I also believe that there are plenty of criminal organizations in, say, American inner cities which are destructive. That does not mean that ultimately the blame does not fall upon our politicians and criminal justice system for facilitating the systems which allowed these things to emerge. At the end of the day, it is people in power who guide the lives of those around them, not the victimized. America guided the conflict between the Native Americans and us, the colonizers. Israel guides the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people. If they truly wanted peace, there were many things that Israel could have done over the past several decades and could do today to bring about peace. But Israel does not want peace. Israel wants the systemic elimination of the Palestinian people. Whether by their death or the seizure of their land or their exile, slowly but surely, Israel would take over like the machine, you know, what's it? The constantly replicating, what are they? Nanobots? Yeah, like a mold or something. They're just cover it. The gray goo scenario, just cover the whole thing. And that is unacceptable to me. What is happening to the Palestinian people is undeniably a genocide. Now, thankfully, because I'm not a fucking idiot, it is possible for me to believe that the Israeli government is committing a genocide against the Palestinian people, and also believe that Israeli citizens, the, beating heart, the living people in Israel, deserve to live comfortable and safe lives. I believe both groups do. The only entity in the world, the only entity in the universe with the power to bring about that peace is Israel. That's it. The Palestinians do not have this power. For them, acquiescence means death. A slow death, but death nonetheless. Israel has the power. And if you are truly, by the way, in favor of peace here, if you're truly in favor of some sort of amicable, both sides, we should all be happy, etc., then this should be a no-brainer to you. But unfortunately, as some people in chat have wildly demonstrated, There are people who have bought into propaganda and are now abetting, enabling, and defending genocide because of their fears of Israeli persecution. To which I must remind you, and I'm very, very sorry to have to do this, Israel is currently backed by the most powerful military force on the planet. The last time they had a major military conflict, it lasted like 2 seconds, and they tripled the size of their territory, okay? Israel is not a victim here. They are the victor, and they are doing everything in their power from military force to extensive and aggressive... Hold on. We need to ban some people, I think. Extensive and aggressive elimination of the Palestinian land, culture, what have you, etc., etc. Their behavior is unacceptable. This is a very straightforward position that I think any reasonable person should take. I don't know why there's so much contention. Can you explain to the idiots in chat that just because an official state of Palestine didn't yet exist, the people living there were forcibly expelled by a colonial state? They would never say that in my chat about Native Americans. Most of the arguments that people use to defend the Israeli treatment of Palestinians fall flat when you apply them to literally any other group of oppressed people. Can you imagine that? Honestly, you could do all of this with the Native Americans. There wasn't an official Native American state. They just lived in tribal societies. They didn't own the land. They raided colonial villages. They attacked our people, you know? We had no choice but to move 3,000 miles westward. You can make all these arguments, same back and forth, back and forth. Ridiculous. And Yang should be ashamed for what he said on Twitter, okay?